Hello and welcome everybody to our inaugural dialogue, Why Food Justice Now? Before we begin, please note that this event is being recorded. We kindly ask that all participants keep their microphones muted throughout the session to minimize background noise. You're welcome to keep your video off. Only speakers will have their cameras on while presenting. This event marks the launch of our Food Justice Dialogue series, which will explore critical questions around food justice and the G20 agenda. With South Africa holding the G20 presidency, the government has placed food security at the center of its policy focus. Key priorities include addressing macroeconomic drivers of food insecurity, particularly food price volatility, through proposals such as diversified supply chains, buffer stocks, support for local and subsistence farming, and efforts to reduce food waste. In partnership with civil society organizations and grassroots movements to food justice in South Africa, this series will explore the complex and interconnected dimensions of food justice and foster meaningful dialogue on transformative policy solutions. The dialogue aims to localize G20 food justice discussions, amplify the voices of progressive civil society, and explore concrete national and international policy responses. My name is Refilwe, and I coordinate the Food Sovereignty Program at the Rosa Luxemburg Stichting that is based in Johannesburg, South Africa. This event is organized and hosted by the Heinrich Böll Foundation Office South Africa in collaboration with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation Southern Africa Regional Office. The Heinrich Böll Foundation has worked in South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, for over 30 years to support democracy, human rights, gender and ecological justice, and inclusive dialogue. This event is hosted under their International Dialogue and African Perspectives program, which promotes the principle of global solidarity, human rights, and gender democracy to strengthen a societal vision for a just, feminist, and sustainable development path for Africa. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is an internationally active, progressive, non-profit organization for political education. Since its founding in 1990, the foundation has engaged in the analysis of social processes and developments through its teams in over 26 regional and country offices. The foundation works with hundreds of partner organizations, political actors, and individuals in over 80 countries. The aim of the foundation's work is to strengthen emancipatory political forces. I am pleased to introduce you to our panel. First, starting with our first keynote, Olivier de Schutter, who was appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights by the Human Rights Council in March 2020, a professor of law at UC Leuven in Brussels, Belgium, and Sciences Po in Paris, France. Mr. de Schutter is also a member of the Global Law Faculty at New York University, a member of the Council of the European Committee of Social Rights, and co-chair of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, IPES-Food. Between 2008 and 2014, he fulfilled the mandate as United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Our next co-keynote speaker, Professor Raj Patel, is a research professor at the University of Texas at Austin and a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, IPES-Food. He is a best-selling author of many books, and his research on political ecology and food systems has been widely translated and taught, particularly his book Stuffed and Starved: The Hidden Battle for the World Food System. He recently completed an award-winning documentary on climate change, gender, and agroecology called The Ants and the Grasshopper.
Thank you very much indeed, Refilo. And let me first of all acknowledge the important collaboration that is taking place today within or between the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the Heinrich Böll Foundation, two organizations which I'm deeply indebted towards. And I think it's fantastic that you are joining forces in this series of meetings around food justice. One of the quotes I like the most from Heinrich Böll, a Nobel Prize in Literature, is when he said, our dreams too are part of reality. And by this, Heinrich Böll meant that we had to dare try to implement our dreams and not take solace with the way things are organized. And I think it's a very good motto for the series of meetings that we are inaugurating today around the idea of food justice. I also welcome the fact that the Institute for Economic Justice is part of this discussion. They are a highly respected group of lawyers litigating socioeconomic rights before courts, and I'm particularly pleased that they achieved this important victory recently on the social relief of distress grant that was being dismantled in South Africa, but that they could provisionally at least rescue. So thank you also to them for their advocacy work. Now, given that this is the first of a series of meetings on food justice, I'd like to say a few words in the few minutes I have before listening to my very dear friend, Raj Patel. I'd like to say a few words about the idea of food justice itself and why this approach to addressing food systems is important today. In fact, for many years, and in part because the production of food is dependent on natural resources and on weather-related events, food has often been discussed with the tools of natural sciences, or sometimes more fashionably with the use of an Earth systems approach that essentially looks at the connection between food production and the ecosystems. Similarly, food consumption has largely been looked at in relation to the physiological needs of the individuals rather than being related to how tastes are shaped by advertising, social norms and habits and the pressures of contemporary life. So to a large extent, food has been discussed as in relation to what the natural environment provides as constraints and as solutions. In contrast, the food justice approach to food systems denaturalizes and politicizes the question of food systems reform. It moves away from a focus on production and on satisfying the physiological needs of the individual, as if these were merely technical problems which the prowesses of technology could adequately address. Instead, a food justice approach challenges the classic economic theory about how prices are formed as the intersection between supply and demand, and it tries to politicize the issue of price making. And it does so in two ways. First, at the macro level, the food justice approach insists that prices really reflect not the use value, how food satisfies the basic needs of people in poverty. Rather, it insists that food prices reflect the exchange value of food as a commodity as determined by the purchasing power of the richest groups of the population. And that's important because in a highly unequal society such as the South African, but such as many societies across the world, when the richest groups of the population can pay a high price for certain items, including food items, the prices can go up and people in poverty will be priced out from that same item as a result of the prices being set by this grand auctioning mechanism, which is in fact the marketplace. And at the micro level, at the different segments of the food chain, the food justice approach notes that the prices reflect the bargaining power of the actors involved as defined by the range of options at their disposal. In other terms, prices are not simply at the intersection of curves of supply and demand. They are the result of power relationships, but power relationships with which very often economists do not recognize. And so this is what I would like to emphasize, and I would like to acknowledge the added value of a food justice approach. Now, in the context of the global debate about how food systems should be reformed, I think it's really important to recognize that the food justice approach to food systems reform is also the result of a failure of other frameworks that have sought to provide a diagnosis about what needs to be done and a set of solutions to propose to policymakers, particularly under the label of green revolution approaches. The focus has been over the past 50 years on increasing production in order to increase the amount of calories available per capita on the global scale by various technologies, including large-scale irrigation, the use of improved plant varieties, mechanization of production, and the use of external inputs, pesticides and fertilizers in particular. The idea was, in fact, with the Green Revolution approaches that were popularized in the 1960s, to increase production in order to respond to the threat of scarcity and thus hope that the prices will go down. And in certain ways, the Green Revolution approach was successful in the sense that industrial agriculture did expand, production did increase, and the challenge of demographic growth and increasing demand was met by this significant increase in supply. However, these advances resulting from the Green Revolution have proven insufficient to eradicate hunger. The absolute number of people who are hungry in the world has remained more or less stable throughout the years, around 820 million people suffering from undernutrition. And in fact, that figure has increased in recent years as a result of conflicts and climate change related events in particular. The relative number of people suffering from hunger has gradually decreased over the past 40 years in most regions, with the notable exception, however, of sub-Saharan Africa, where the proportion of people who are hungry has remained stable and even increased in certain respects. Moreover, even where food intake is sufficient, even when people are not starving, inadequate diets can result in micronutrient deficiencies, such as the lack of iodine, of vitamin A, or of iron. And thirdly, the Green Revolution approach encouraged dietary transitions that reduced diversity for many groups of the population, leading to the growth of non-communicable diseases, type 2 diabetes, heart diseases, and gastrointestinal cancers linked to insufficiently diverse diets. And this is what scientists call the triple burden of hunger, malnutrition, and overweight. And indeed, in a deeply unequal country such as South Africa, facing a nutrition transition, countries face these three burdens at the same time. Green Revolution approaches have not only proven unable to eradicate hunger and malnutrition, they also have caused, as we all know, environmental impacts, causing the pollution of soils and groundwater, the erosion of biodiversity, the growth of greenhouse gas emissions, due both to the reliance on fossil energy in food production, what IPES-Food calls from fuel to fork in a recent report, and resulting also from the loss of carbon content of the soil and the ability for soils to function as carbon sinks. Now, against this background of the failure of Green Revolution approaches that focused on productivist solutions to addressing hunger and malnutrition, the added value of a food justice approach is that it encourages us to understand why we have been led to this situation and where reforms should now be pursued. And in fact, the objective of the food justice approach is to bring to the discussion the question of power, a question that is often ignored, sidelined, and certainly not well measured by economists working on food systems. In that sense, the food justice approach complements what the rise of the food sovereignty movement has been achieving since the mid-1990s, food sovereignty, which has developed as an alternative paradigm for agricultural development and food systems reform over the past 30 years, at the start because it was pushed for by the Via Campesina and the global organization of small-scale farmers, but now it has become a claim of a large range of social movements opposed to the pressures resulting from trade liberalization in agricultural products and the globalization of supply chains. Let me identify the three major challenges that the food justice approach faces today, which I think we should keep in mind when moving towards solutions, including the idea of having buffer stocks organized to reduce the price volatility on food markets. The first challenge is that the food systems we inherit from are made of different components, technological innovations, an organization of agricultural production that bets on economies of scale and large-scale production by major agri-food companies, a capture of the political system by these major actors, and finally, consumers whose tastes, consuming habits are being shaped by the advertising of the agri-food industry itself. And these different components of food systems, technological, economic, political, and cultural, have been combining with each other. They have co-evolved in order to form a system. So they are mutually reinforcing each other. And although distinct, they form a system which is very inert because all these components, technical, economic, political, and cultural, are conspiring to keep the system in place. And that is the first challenge we have to face, making reform very difficult to achieve. The second challenge is in our inability to really address power in food chains. In fact, what we've seen over the past 40 years is that small-scale farmers have been gradually squeezed out of business in rich countries and constitute a large proportion, perhaps a majority, of those who are hungry in the global south. So that strengthening the position of small-scale farmers in food chains would make a significant contribution to the ability of peasant agriculture to develop, as well as a major contribution to the reduction of rural poverty. But addressing the question of power in food chains is not just a matter of protecting better the weaker party in relationships between different actors in the food chains. It also is in the general interest. In fact, a significant portion of the waste in food chains has its source in the practices of supermarkets and of food manufacturing companies towards their suppliers, whether these buyers encourage overproduction before deciding at the last minute that they shall not need to order all the food that has been prepared for them, or whether they reject some produce that is supplied on purely cosmetic grounds or because that food is nearing its sell-by date. In other terms, addressing power in food chains, strengthening the ability of small-scale food producers to obtain a better price for their produce and to have their bargaining position improved is in the interest of a more efficient functioning of food chains and not simply a means to tackle rural poverty and to address hunger and malnutrition facing small-scale food producers. The third and final challenge we face is that typically change in food systems requires that actions be taken at different levels of governance, from the private governance by retailers imposing their own standards on suppliers, to the international agencies promoting the growth of global trade and the adoption of global regulatory standards, facilitating such trade and including local governments, regions, and states. And all these actors of food systems should ideally understand their role in achieving transformation in food systems and should have their efforts complement each other rather than annul each other's efforts. Um, but this is not easy to achieve. And in fact, democratic accountability for food systems reform has been weakened over the years. Donna Freeman from the London School of Economics describes as the de-democratization of the state the current process in which central governments delegate more powers to local authorities, privatize a number of public services, or delegate standard setting functions to corporate actors, and in addition, submit to disciplines enjoining international regimes. In other terms, what Donna Freeman emphasizes is that states are less and less in a position to make a difference. Governments control less and less the evolution of food systems because they decentralize, they privatize, and they delegate to supranational bodies that are themselves captured by the lobbies, by the major economic interests of the system. The impact of this de-democratization of the state on food systems reforms are deeply ambiguous. On the one hand, this triple de-democratization we currently see occurring may reduce the risk of power being abused by the central government, since such processes, of course, disempower the state. Therefore, it is more difficult for powerful economic interests to capture the state because of this decentralization taking place. On the other hand, however, this leads to a fragmentation of power, making it more difficult for the government to achieve reform, since any attempt at reform at one level of government may be obstructed, prohibited, discouraged by the other levels. So, to conclude, on the food justice approach, on the introduction of power as a key ingredient in food systems reform, and on the obstacles we face and the challenges we must address, let me say this. Under the banner of the right to food in particular, there is a strong push today towards holding governments accountable to ensure that food systems lead to just outcomes. Power, however, does not reside only with governments. It is pervasive within food systems. It is indeed perhaps private power that now deserves the greatest attention because it lacks any form of accountability. The challenge of the food justice approach to food systems is to address private government, the unchecked power of incumbents in mainstream food systems who will oppose all change, who have managed to translate their economic dominance into political influence. Ultimately, food justice is about food democracy. Like food sovereignty, it is about reclaiming control. And I would like to thank you all, to thank the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, and the Institute for Economic Justice for being part of this important endeavor. I look forward to listening to my very dear friend, Raj Patel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for that very powerful contribution to ground today's critical discussion, challenging power dynamics in our food system and the role of governments is very important as we begin this discussion. To respond to Mr. Olivier, I'm going to invite our two discussants, two local leaders and activists. But before I do that, my apologies. Unfortunately, Caroline Peters is not able to join us today. In her place, Phelisa Mashiyi is stepping in. Phelisa is a social worker and program director at Callas Foundation. So she works alongside Caroline. Phelisa leads transformative initiatives focused on gender, justice, healing, and community empowerment. With a decade of experience in the NGO sector, she has worked extensively with diverse communities, providing direct support, counseling, and advocacy services. Her work includes gender-based violence interventions and prevention programs, facilitating access to justice for survivors, and creating safe spaces for healing and reflection. Phelisa has partnered with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to support women in conflict with the law, and has also worked for the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa to support survivors throughout the court processes. Alongside her is Nangamso NomaHlubi Koza that I introduced earlier, the co-founder of the Global Atlantic Fellowship Food Sovereignty Network and founder of the Umhlaba Yempilo Food Sovereignty Movement. And our discussants this afternoon are going to provide us with some contextual grounding and share current food justice discussions that are unfolding in South Africa, particularly in relation to their own work in challenging power and the dominance of industry in our food system, and why these interventions are imperative at this moment. And in order, they'll also address what can be done in order to make global tools work locally, what practical steps. Olivier de Schutter earlier touched on buffer stocks as an instrument that can be used for food price stabilization, but also support for small-scale producers and informal traders through approaches like agroecology, and how these proposals could work to make the G20 more effective. So without taking any more time, I'm going to hand over to our two discussants, Nangamso and Phelisa. Thank you.
Hi, Rafile. Good morning, afternoon to everybody who's joined us. And thank you very much to the organizers who have invited us. Wow, Oliver, where do we start? Thank you for such an opening. It's such a critical time globally and in South Africa as well. So with the 5 minutes that I have, I am going to try my level best to respond while sharing some of the best practices that we've learned throughout our engagements with communities in South Africa. So you speak about, right, the food justice approach in a manner that resembles what we view as the restoration of dignity to our people. As South Africa, we are people who come from, as we know, a history of colonization, apartheid, that stripped away everything that we are, what we believe in, from our land to our water, our connection to the soil that we have grown up for years having depended on for food. But that needs structural and systemic address, we believe. Currently in South Africa, we have 32,000 approximately farmers who produce 80% of the food that we consume. And from that, we know that majority of them are white, older males. And now this speaks to the structural and systemic exclusion of marginalized and Black communities the most. And by Black, we mean colored, we mean everybody identifying as Black. And we know that that puts us at the end of the food chain, making us to be continuous beggars. So in response to that, what we did through Umhlaba Yempilo was to simultaneously institutionalize a food sovereignty program that's rooted on the capacitation and support of unemployed parents who reported as saying that through the program, they now do not have to worry about at least that one meal that their kids can get when they arrive at school. And so our program, what it does is it addresses a lot. And just to summarize, so we address why there's said poverty, right? Which is intentional. How is it that if we are to say for food justice to be what it needs to be, there is a need for said sovereignty, as Prof. Shiva always reminds us of, that we need said sovereignty. And we've addressed that through creating community food banks that are mostly run by women. And these food banks, and we know that food banks initially were started to preserve, to distribute, right, indigenous seeds. But we also know that now there's development within the management of seed, the seed economy, where peasant farmers and, there's Black rural women actually utilize these seeds to sustain themselves and run an informal seed enterprise system outside of what the formalized structures expect of them. So if we're to get for democracy, what we've done is to look into how we protect our soil and our biodiversity. With the current climate challenge that we have, we've gone back now to understanding in our context what food pairing, for instance, means. So we work our soil using our indigenous ways of using goat manure, chicken manure, because we know that the type of nitrogen those two manures have actually enables us to plant, seeds immediately. We don't have to wait for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And what that has done is it has opened up another market within the informal, as it's put, food production system, where within the communities now, older men and women who farm goats, now suddenly there's a market for their manure. And we look at, and that's the empowerment, that's the empowering the local food producers. And what we've done is to create an ecosystem that excludes the formalized food production players who have been dominant in this sector. We currently have 3 schools who do not buy vegetables and who produce their own foods, saving their vegetables. And it's done. That is food justice, right? Because food justice then, which is why we speak about food sovereignty, mostly not about food security, because we know food security speaks about access to food, but food sovereignty goes deeper and speaks about the control, who controls this food. And it speaks about, culturally appropriate food that's being produced in a way that does not harm our environment, in a way that is responsive to the current climate challenge that we're facing, and how we're trying to protect our air, our soil, our water. And lastly, so our advice would be in this context, and in responding to you, to President Ramaphosa, would be, so there's a need for systemic pathways to be created for policy redevelopment. Because currently where we are, our policies continue to marginalize the very peasant communities and the very rural communities that depend on this only less than 20% of the food that is produced by people who do not even represent who they are and where they come from. And the indigenous knowledge systems, you spoke about the Via Campesina, who will always be grateful to the Latin American community for how they've popularized the food sovereignty framework. So we speak about the indigenous knowledge systems as being core and grounding in us understanding what food production systems need to look like. Because then the power belongs to the people, the power stays with the people. And what we've seen, especially in SADA, with where Umhlaba Impilo has been for the past at least 2 years, has been advocating for food justice in South Africa. And this is a province, one of the poorest provinces in South Africa, where the South African Human Rights Commission in 2022 released a very shocking report. But we know, for those of us who are on the ground, we know it very well, that 1 in every 4 kids in the Eastern Cape province dies of malnutrition. And if you look at where we are as the province and what needs to happen, not just in fact the Eastern Cape province, but the broader rural communities within the SADC region and the African continent itself. You look at what the Kenyan community is doing in fighting for the GMO seeds that are being imposed on them. So that's what needs to happen. There needs to be, and MST does a great job, MST from Brazil, in mobilizing communities and creating a very strong network. Because through mobilized communities, then we've got a bargaining power to be able to push for peasant and for rural centered, people-centered approach to addressing and eradicating the systems and policies that continue to marginalize us. I think my 5 minutes is up. I'm looking at my timer.
Yes, indeed it is. Thanks,
very much.
Nangamso, for that rich contribution. I'm handing over to you, Phelisa.
Yes, thank you so much, Refiwe. And I think I'm just listening to Nangamso in response to our presenter, Mr. Olivier. And I'm immediately thinking, because I work with communities, and when we sit in these conversations, the first thing that I think about is, how do we then localize those conversations? When we're having conversations from the top, who are they then serving? Especially when we're looking at issues of food justice, right? The communities that we work with, do they even understand the terms of food justice? What is urgent to them when we speak about such issues? And even looking at food systems reform, what does that mean for communities? Because sometimes we are so quick to have conversations on the changing of policies or integrating certain instruments or frameworks in addressing issues of food insecurity in the different communities. But we're not necessarily having conversations with the people that actually are directly affected, right? So as an organization, our core focus is around providing support to survivors of gender-based violence. And our need to take part in such conversations is understanding that one of the contributing factors, or one of the reasons why a person stay in abusive relationship, is food insecurity. And it becomes then a social issue for us. It's not only about hunger, it's also looking at violence in relation to food insecurity. So through our different networks with our community kitchens, we are able to ensure that we provide the necessary nutritions that individuals in certain communities require, right? And Nangamso was saying that when we speak about food insecurity, we speak about excess, right? And again, when we're looking at, when people don't have money, they don't have access to food. When food prices are high, people don't have access to food. So therefore, they become food insecure. And those are conversations that can be very difficult to have from a local standpoint where we are based, especially with the people that are directly affected. But I'm also of the understanding that sometimes solutions also come from the people that are directly affected. They best know how to engage in conversations and what can be done to address certain issues that they are facing. So with the partnerships that we've had with different community kitchens within the Western Cape, we're able to provide daily meals to individuals that are food insecure and they don't have access to food. And through those different partnerships, we're able to also reach different communities. And that is done through partnerships with your Food Forward SA and all the different stakeholders that are working in the field of food insecurity and trying to assist in that regard. And having those conversations even with the different community kitchens to see how we can best assist, with the understanding that we also don't have enough resources to be able to assist everyone in the communities that we are working in. So it becomes again a conversation of, how do we then ensure that our communities are able to benefit, and those conversations are going to be beneficial to our communities. So late last year, what we also did as an organization, we had partnered with Union Against Hunger, and we form part of the steering committee of that coalition, where we are having mini endeavors within the different provinces to have conversations around food justice and what does food justice mean for the communities, not what we see from where we are, because sometimes as a social worker, my stance on when it comes to assisting any individual is for them to make the decisions themselves and for them to have an understanding of whatever issue that they are facing, which is the same thing when we speak about issues of food insecurity. What is the community's understanding of food insecurity? How can they benefit from whatever systems that we want to put in place so that those systems become sustainable? And currently what we're seeing, and I think Olivier did reference the social relief grant, and I think that was 350. And that's when we're speaking about the prices of food in South Africa, 350 will only last you a day. And remember, this 350 is maybe for someone who has a family of 5 or family of 6. So that money is not even enough to be able to sustain a person. And with those conversations, again, it becomes important for us to speak about sustainability. Even though we have community kitchens to ensure that people have access to food, nutritious food at that, how do we ensure that that is also sustainable? How do we build on that? And again, it goes back to the conversations around, especially where we are, I see something on the chat, especially where we are in the community, where we're looking at, sometimes you would have, let's say, maybe Fana saying, we need to plant food, we need to have small gardens and all of those things. You look about the issue of land. Do we have land to be able to do those things? Which for many community kitchens that we work with or that form part of the network, there isn't space to plant any food that would then be sustainable for the community kitchens and in turn for our communities. So again, it's the question around how do we then localize the conversations to ensure that communities are benefiting. And when we speak about food systems reform or food justice, we are able to get information from the people that are directly affected, so that when we come with solutions, they're going to then be addressing the issues that are directly affecting the communities that we are speaking about. And the importance and what we've seen with the mini indabas that we did with Union Against Hunger is that we are able to document conversations and dialogues that we're having in communities, and being able to translate that to a document that can be taken to Parliament, that can be taken to international spaces when we're speaking about food security or food access or food justice. So it's also helping us to translate what is being said on the ground by community members. And I think sometimes because we are in communities, we see everything that is happening. And when we hear certain statistics in regards to food security in the country, you also question even those statistics because we see what's happening. And sometimes it doesn't really translate to what we are saying. And I think we are also known as a country that underreports a lot. So I think sometimes that also becomes an issue, even when we look at the poverty rates in the country, the unemployment rates in the country, and all of those things. Sometimes it's not a reflection of the different communities that we are in and what we are saying. So it becomes important for us to have this conversation. So even with our community kitchen, it becomes a safe space for clients to come in and have these conversations. Because when we speak about serving people food, no one wants to come and queue for food unless they have to, right? And so now the conversations around having to ensure that there's enough food and having to ensure that people have access to food is also, again, speaking to the communities and ensuring that whatever solutions or ideas that we have are really going to be beneficial to the communities. And that's again with conversations. Who are we speaking to? Who are we having conversations to? What informs our current policies, and how are we ensuring that it's a reflection of what the communities are saying? So that really becomes important to us. Last year, what we also did is we did a desktop research to also try and understand how many households within the community that we're serving are food insecure and what other challenges are also related to that. That's when we also have conversations around and an understanding around why women stay or why persons stay in abusive relationships. It also speaks to food insecurity. So you see the different intersectionality
Thank you.
when we speak about food insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you, Phelisa, and so sorry to cut you off there, but you'll have another opportunity after Prof. Raja's contribution to pick up on that. Thank you so much. And the issue that you've highlighted, South Africans are net food buyers, and it means low income and poor households are particularly vulnerable to some of the anti-competitive practices of the market and also to the very design of our food system in South Africa. So thanks for touching on those issues, but also thank you for the encouraging anecdotes about the work that you're doing at the community level and the agency of communities in trying to bridge the gap between policy and the people and coming up with innovations for food justice. For our second keynote address, we are honored to welcome Professor Raj Patel, renowned scholar from the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Patel will share insights from his latest publication in the Journal of Peasant Studies entitled Counter Hegemony and Policy Crisis: How to Eat and How to Think.
I'm hoping folk can hear me. Refilwe, I think you may have frozen. Are people able to
Yes.
hear me? Excellent.
Now we can hear you. I've switched off my video. Yes, we can hear you. Great.
Thank you, comrade. And hello, Sani Bonani, guten Tag. It's an honor to be here. I'd very much like to thank the organizers for convening this and for convening such a terrifyingly impressive audience. It's so many people from whom I have learned and continue to learn. Being here today makes me just a little nervous. But thank you so much. And thank you so much, Nangamso, for talking about food sovereignty and for reminding us that, yes, the language of food security is just terrifyingly minimal. You can be food secure in prison, but the whole point of food justice and food sovereignty is to emancipate ourselves. And thank you, Phelisa, for foregrounding power and gender relations in particular, and for the work that you're doing at the grassroots. And most of all, thank you, Olivier, for your leadership and your vision, for being not just an advocate, but a conduit for justice through your mandates as United Nations two mandates in different capacities as Special Rapporteur, and for convening us in the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food System. It is an honor to follow you and to count you as my friend. I wonder if I can share my screen in a way that is visible. Let's see. Is the magic working right here? I can't tell, but I'm hoping it is. And I just want to really try and stand on the shoulders of Olivier's presentation to really talk about about food justice. And let's see if I can play this slide. Is that, yeah, we are advancing very slowly. This is from the latest United Nations report on hunger and food security, and you can see precisely as Olivier was saying that there's a long-term downward trend now interrupted by an increase that precedes COVID. Really, it starts from 2016 in the number of people who are undernourished and in the prevalence of undernourishment. So the percentage and the absolute number of people who are undernourished. We can also see, that if we are thinking about justice and undernourishment, we can't have this conversation without observing the catastrophe that is the famine in Gaza. It is a reminder, first of all, that while states may be retreating in some areas, there is one state in particular that is acutely and singularly responsible for this catastrophe, for this genocide. And I'm grateful for South Africa's leadership in calling it what it is and using the mechanisms of international law, which have been so eroded by the United States and by Israel's actions. But let's return to this average, which again erases the horrors in Gaza and other areas of the world where there is famine. And let's zoom in a little bit to look really at this rise since 2016, made more acute by COVID, and which has recently begun to show some promise of diminishing, although by no means enough to be able to meet the UN SDGs of eradicating extreme hunger by 2030. The main drivers of the recent fall in the prevalence of undernourishment are twofold. One, figures in India have been restated, and I've tried to study them, and I remain a little baffled as to how India has through statistics managed to erase quite so many people from its rosters of hunger. And there's a big question mark for me over the Indian data. But one area where we can unequivocally celebrate is Brazil. And Brazil obviously is an agricultural powerhouse of precisely the kind that Olivier was talking about, as a sort of green revolution hub that is driving both huge increases in production, but also deforestation and the climate crisis. Let's look at how Brazil has fared. If we look at the number of moderately or severely food insecure people in Brazil, we'll notice a trend. I mean, that from a sort of low in 2014 to 2016, there's been slight rises, and then from 2019 onwards, a precipitous rise. And you'll notice obviously that hunger is gendered, that there are more women than men who are moderately or severely food insecure. And this story is one that is independent of production. As Olivier said, merely having more food does not result in the erasure of hunger. We know that the story of hunger is not a story of production, and it isn't even a story about new policy. It's a story about power and politics. Because what we see if we if we go back to this food insecurity graph, is actually just a story of Brazil at the beginning adopting a range of policies that the PT, the Workers' Party, had introduced in its political effort to combat hunger, a shift away from that under the Bolsonaro administration, and then a return to those policies. These are not new policies. These are old policies that are re-implemented. So really what we're talking about when we're talking about food justice is power, the choice between the sort of authoritarianism and far-right government of Bolsonaro and the center-left visions of Lula. And that suggests that actually our discussions of policy are at some level trivial. We know the policies. We need to think about justice not as an outcome, but as a procedure. And I want to reflect, as Olivier did, quoting Heinrich Böll, that one of that Rosa Luxemburg herself talked about Sozialismus oder Barbarei, socialism or barbarism. And unfortunately, there's quite a lot of barbarism around here in the United States. Obviously, we see the rise of authoritarianism, particularly with the occupation of Washington, D.C., with the kinds of military infrastructure that we would associate, that will be familiar actually with to folk in South Africa from merely the late 1980s. But I wanted to very briefly talk about a movement that was instrumental in achieving food sovereignty and much more at a stage of the growth of a country that is about as old as Free South Africa or as a post-military junta Brazil is now. And that country is Italy. I want to talk very briefly about some workers in the Po Valley in Italy. Italy has been for centuries is Europe's largest rice exporter. The rice industry, as you'll know, is very labor intensive, and in the Po Valley, the workers there were predominantly migrant workers and predominantly women. They were called mondine, and their job was to weed rice in the 40 days or so before harvest. And it's unforgiving work. And these women were, these are government-provided hats, by the way, and they were in the fields, sponsored in part by a government looking for cheap labor for its rice industry. But they were organizing. They were organizing against the mephitic conditions in the fields. There was malaria everywhere. It was a public health emergency. They were, the conditions were incredibly hot. They were fighting against, the climate and the treatment of them as very shoddily as workers. They were being brought together and organized by socialist organizers and by anarchists. And they started to form the backbone of the Italian labor movement. They organized to form unions. They were agents of solidarity, so that they put their bodies on the line on the train tracks to stop rice being taken out of the Po Valley by train in solidarity with urban social movements. So these are women who understood that they couldn't win their battles in rural areas without transformation in urban areas and vice versa. And the head of the Italian Confederation of Trade Unions was a woman from this organization. They understood that you can't reconfigure the food system without taking gender very centrally and very seriously. And they understood that this is a multidimensional crisis, that a crisis around environmental issues is also a crisis of hunger, is also a crisis of women's rights, is also a crisis both in urban and in rural areas. And it can be solved not just by direct action, but also through the articulations of an increasingly international trade union movement, and an international labor movement, and an international movement of movements against capitalism. These were the women who were instrumental in fighting the incipient fascism in Italy. And you may know the song Bella Ciao, the partisan song that was sung by Italians who were fighting the fascists. But you may not know that that song originally was a song by rice weeders discussing their labor. And it's a beautiful song that begins with waking up in the morning and having to go in the paddy fields. But it's a song that ends in from moving from I to we. It's about the future when we all will be free. And that idea of liberty forged in through work and through engagement with the rest of the web of life, and engaged in a process of experimenting with social movement change, is something that I think we need to learn from very directly at the moment. I mean, these were comrades who were conducting scientific experiments. I mean, this is one way of recognizing and honoring the work of our social movement comrades, not as reactive to the injustices and inequities of powers, but as experiments in trying to level those terrains of power. And sometimes those experiments are wildly successful. I just want to share quickly, I mean, if we think about where the rice weeders are and come from, it's really the sort of dark green areas in this map. But so successful at organizing were the Mondine that even now, we can see the trace of their social movement experiments in gender equality, in workers' rights, and in an organizing a counter-hegemony. That means organizing a bloc against the power of the ruling class and those fractions of the working class they managed to buy off. So if you look here, here are the dark green areas, and here, this is from a forthcoming paper that is absolutely fascinating. But if you look across Italy now, you can tell where the Mondine were, because more women are engaged in politics, more people in general stand up for women's rights, and there are more nursery schools in those areas where the Mondine came from. I mean, the Mondine came from all over Italy, and they reconfigured what it meant to be Italian when this idea of being Italian was very young. And I think that matters for us now, because we need to imagine justice as a process of counter-hegemony. We need to understand that it's within living memory that South Africa looked like this, where there were townships that were routinely patrolled by the forces of authoritarianism and the SADF. You had a moment where South Africa understood that in order to resist this, you needed a united democratic front, a front where different movements would come together in opposition to the force of the state and reconstitute what it meant to be from this place. And the good news is that if we're open to that historical memory, to the memory that actually it's possible to redefine what it is to be from a place, then there are movements on the ground right now that are practicing the building of counter-hegemony, the building of experiments in pushing back against the power of capital and its control over the state and its buying off of a fraction of the working class. And those movements, for example, in South Africa look like Abahlali Basemjondolo, where you have, I mean, I have a prejudice in favor of Abahlali. I was there at its founding 20 years ago. And I've seen how this movement is now a movement of over 160,000 paying members and led in large part by women in its local branches and who are tackling issues of food insecurity through food sovereignty. And tackling gender inequality through organizing for care as a response, not just to the encroachment of the state and the violence of neoliberalism and the poverty that it inflicts, but also as a process of building solidarity. And these, the work that's happening in Abahlali around food sovereignty, for example, has been driven not because Abahlali itself came up with this language, but precisely, as Nangamso was talking about earlier on, through its interactions with groups like the MST, the Landless Rural Workers Movement from Brazil, who visited South Africa and who have encouraged agroecological transition and agroecological planting of gardens and small farms within and near to the shack settlements. And I think this is precisely an example of the counter-hegemonic organizing and experiments in trying to make change that have been successful elsewhere in the world. I mean, if we think about Brazil, for instance, the MST has partnered with its urban counterpart, the MTST, and the MTST has been setting up solidarity kitchens. It's managed to get some of its activists into government and managed to open up the possibility of the government procuring food from MST farms, where the movement itself owns the supply chain and where the movement is paid by the government to cook in solidarity kitchens, which are also organizing hubs to promulgate the movement. And this kind of approach to developing food sovereignty is also a response to the climate crisis, and is also a response to the inequities in power, is a way of taking this fragmented state, as Olivier told us about earlier on, and nonetheless figuring out ways of reclaiming its power for solidarity. And it's a way, if you're curious about this, I mean, these kinds of international experiments and interactions are a way in which we are starting to name the work of care that is being undertaken by movements, often by women within the movements, as a response to the climate crisis, to democratic decline, to the rise of capitalism, to the rise of authoritarian capitalism in particular, and offers a way of providing new experiments for radical social change. And so I realize that we have too much to talk about today for me to carry on for too long. But I do just want to leave us with these ideas that actually, if we're interested in food justice, then we need to think about precisely the questions of power that everyone has mentioned today. But if we are serious about those questions of power, then we ought to realize that historically, in moments of crisis like this, when we're experiencing a global crisis of certainly of US hegemony and a loosening of the bounds of possibility that come with the decline of the US, then we also need to recognize that where we are in the clock of the world is a moment where these radical experiments are possible and much more likely to succeed than in periods past. We've seen these kinds of experiments in one way or another before, but there are only certain moments in the clock of the world where it becomes possible. This is one of them, and they only succeed not because an individual organization or NGO or movement does it, but because it's done as part of a front that tries to counter the hegemony that is declining. And our task right now is to achieve this food justice procedurally by being just every step of the way, recognizing gender inequality, recognizing histories of race, recognizing class inequality, and recognizing how they're all articulated, but also recognizing that unless we form this block together, we will hang apart. So thank you very much, comrades, for your time. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for your very compelling insights and provocations. Once again, I invite our two discussants to take the floor and respond to Prof. Patel's contribution this afternoon, and a few leading questions for your discussion. I think you touched on some of the practices that have been adopted by communities, some of the systems that communities have put in place that combine care work and food provision at the community level. And for this next very short section for responses before we move to the Q&A, I wanted to ask, how should South Africa address the racialized, gendered divisions of labor in farming, in retail, and care work? On the large-scale commercial farms that dominate South Africa's agriculture, we know that men and women are treated differently. Particularly in the case of, for instance, pesticides, which is another campaign that's being driven by grassroots movements. We know that often men may have access to protective gear, whereas women wouldn't. Men may have access to some of the infrastructure on farms that women don't. So I just wanted to pose that question first, and also how could the G20 influence reforms around social protection, wage protections, and procurement policy support shifts for greater equality and democratization of our food systems? Big questions, and you only have 5 to 7 minutes to answer before we open the floor for participants to raise their questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Refiwe. It's really interesting how Mr. Patel was framing the movement science, which is something that for me as an individual, it's not something that I really take time to think about. And now as I was listening, I was like, oh yes, okay. And like I think I said before in my previous response to Mr. Olivier, when we were speaking about our work with the Union Against Hunger, and I'm thinking that is a movement. That is a movement that speaks to communities, that is inclusive of communities, that tries to initiate ways in which we can, as a collective, shape policies through the dialogues that we're having in the different communities. However, I'm also someone who's a realist when I think of certain things, even when we're doing things from a local level, is when we again speak about power imbalances and equality, the voices of communities around issues of food justice or food security, even within our efforts, are they really taken into consideration when we're looking at change in policies? That is the realist in me, even though we're doing the work, even though we are making sure that the voices of communities are heard. And that also speaks to the shaping the G20 frameworks, the work that we're doing in communities. How do they then feed into those conversations? Who is then sent to discuss those conversations from the countries, especially in South Africa? Are we confident enough as a country and as communities that whoever then represents us, especially on issues around food security, will then be sharing a reflection of what is coming from the communities themselves, which is something that, again, when I look at conversations from a local level, it's always trying to see how do they then inform and shape policies. Are they really doing that? Because we've seen with other issues in the different countries, when we speak about whether it's gender-based violence or anything else that is a challenge or social ill within the country, we have a lot of indabas, we have a lot of conversations, but we're not really seeing them truly shaping policies. And the issues of implementation in the country, we have the policies and we have maybe the frameworks, but in many instances, they don't necessarily filter down when it comes to implementation. So even when we're having this conversation, that's what I'm thinking about. But that also doesn't stop us from being part of movements that are speaking out on issues of food justice and ensuring that our voices are loud enough so that we are able to inform certain policies, and just to ensure that there is a greater understanding that when we have these conversations, it's not conversations that are for ministers or academics, but are conversations for everyone in countries. So that's where I feel the importance of movements also comes in, because then it brings voices of everyone where no one feels like they've been left behind. It becomes inclusive. And also looking at the gender dynamics when we're speaking about food. And now I'm thinking there's been a shift, or just reflecting on the shift that we're seeing even within our community kitchens. A few years ago, we used to have a lot of women coming to collect food. But in the last 2 years, we're seeing a lot of men coming to collect food. 80% of our beneficiaries are men, which is something that is also a bit that we still also need to research and see what is happening. Because when we look at unemployment, we always see as women the people that are not unemployed in terms of employment rates, but we're seeing a lot of men coming for food. And when again we speak about food security or food justice, we always think or think about anyone who's food insecure. We think of a Black woman, or we think of a colored woman, or a person of color. We don't really think of men when we speak about food security. And what we're seeing within our community kitchen, even in the community endeavors that we're having through the Union Against Hunger, we're seeing a lot of men in the space and having conversations around food insecurity and food access. Now, when we're looking at the different, even the role of women when it comes to food insecurity, we're also speaking about the women who work within the different train stations of the Cape Flats that are selling food on a daily basis at lower prices at that, and making it easier for people to be able to have access to food. And those are the women that are in many cases are not seen, or when we look at policies, they undermined. There isn't really any regulation within that sector when we're looking at the informal sector. Informal traders, and especially when we're looking at informal traders of food, and when we're speaking about nutrition, how do we then strengthen that? Because there is something that needs to be researched in that regard, and I'm sure there's research being done. But how do we then use that research to ensure that it informs the way that we think about food justice, and it gives us an opportunity to have conversations at an international or even national level around what can be done and what is being done, and how do we strengthen what the communities are already doing to ensure that everyone has access to food, and how are we shaping those conversations. And I know, again, when we speak about food, I think I mentioned it before, we only think about farming and land and all of those things, but we also need to take into context different communities that don't necessarily have access to that, and people who want to be part of food reform, but don't necessarily have what is required to actively participate in that space. And maybe looking at innovation through the different spheres when we speak about food access and what is being done, and how do we then strengthen those. How do we strengthen those systems that are already in place to ensure that in the next 10, 20 years, we're not having the same conversation, but rather we may be looking at something different. Because now what we're seeing is that we always have conversations around any issues that we're facing, but we're not really getting to the point of implementing to a point where now we can say, this is what has worked, which is becoming really difficult even when framing conversations. Thank you, Rapporteur.
Thank you so much, Phelisa. I'll now hand over to Nangamso.
Thank you very much, Refilwe. So that's why Phelisa, when we speak about Mhlaba Impilo, which translated to English means land is life, we present an alternative. Because at some point we get tired of over communicating about these challenges. And so we learned from best practices globally, and we implemented and we piloted and we produced an alternative. And maybe just a bit as we try and address the gender part as well, Rafilwe. So we're not a charity, we're not a charitable organization. This is a movement that's based on people-centered principles. And it came as a result in the Eastern Cape province, where I come from. I've spoken about it earlier. 8 lives were lost just about 4 years ago. 8 lives, we lost 8 lives. And these 8 lives were 2 mothers who took the lives of 3 of their kids, 3 kids each, 2 mothers. 8 lives were lost because the mothers could not provide food anymore for their children. And that's what moved us, because if that can happen in the rural former Transkei in the Eastern Cape, it can happen at home, my home. And so as a collective, we came together and we asked ourselves, what can be done? So we were quite strategic in what we did, because we already had working relations with the Department of Education. We decided to approach schools. And this wasn't twofold, the reasons. It's because South Africa has a failed land distribution policy and programming. And Phelisa just spoken that some other people do not have access to land to farm. And in this particular community, Sada community, where my umbilical cord is buried, very proud, it was the same issue. It's a community that was established in the, just briefly, in the late 1950s, early 1960s as a dumping site, as a settlement. And so land is limited for farming, and we used schools as strategic points of pulling in communities so that they can have access to, because schools are public schools, that's public land. And we were very intentional in how we curated the programming. Hence, we speak about food sovereignty, because we identified that agroecology is the winning mechanism of achieving food sovereignty. And we believe that that is a way of achieving food justice, because what it does, it doesn't merely address the challenge of food insecurity. What it does, it brings back power to the table of the people, to say to the people, you can produce your own food, you determine when and how, and you determine how it gets processed and how it's shared. That is why we are very proud that we're sharing it with some government officials to say, we know for a fact the 3 schools that have benefited from the work this movement has done, led by women. We're the only school that provides GMO-free broccoli, kale, rape. And this is food that, you know, we grew up thinking it belonged to a different class. I never ate that food growing up because I grew up in the same community. But now you've got kids who wake up from mud homes in those communities, who get to school and eat broccoli. And when they arrive back home, which is what we wanted to address, the food insecurity part, oh, mama made broccoli. I didn't even know, I called it broccoli, but it's broccoli. And so what we've done is that we've got this intergenerational conscientizing space that ensures that the learners, because we incorporated, it's part of the core curricular program. So you've got kids as young as 12 years old who will tell you what umhlaba yimpilo of food sovereignty is. They are part of the food production processes in their schools. They go back home and they tend to their very small little gardens. So imagine, because we keep these kids in the schooling system for 12 years. Imagine when they graduate and get ready to pursue higher education or take advantage of any other opportunities that are available at that time, how conscientized they will be, the politics now of land, the politics of water, the politics of food production, because now there's a generation of kids who watch their moms who were unemployed before go into the schooling system, making meaningful contributions for them to be able to eat quality food, GMO-free food. I mean, the schools in total is 3 schools. They produce not less than 20,000 GMO-free seedlings that are shared within the community. And this is a mostly women-run movement that is surviving on its own. I wrote her name down. Alison spoke about rights-based approach to achieving food sovereignty. The power lies with the community. The power lies with the schools. Now, why we speak about food sovereignty, it is because that control, right? The funny part now is one of the suppliers called one of the primary schools to say, oh, but we see you're not ordering vegetables anymore. Where are you buying your vegetables? Prof. Patel, that's the counter hegemonic system that we're trying to disrupt. The power belongs to the people, and through Mhlaba Impilo, what we're saying is, here's an alternative. It's no longer just about having food gardens in schools, but how do we ensure that speaks to the curriculum?
You see, that's why I put it together.
You are still muted, Nangamso.
Sorry about that, Rufele. So in short, even though our education system does not cover food sovereignty, right? They would never do that. But now we have kids who know that for a fact. This is not less than 1,400 kids. And what we've done now, the movement has gone to train in a small town called Willowville, Bukajane. The movement, the parents have gone to train parents that side. And we have got a network now that's localized in the Eastern Cape of at least 12 schools who want the movement to come. And these are parents who, some didn't even finish basic education, but because the content, the content covers South African history, African history, African philosophy, food sovereignty, soil health, water, all these things that previously they would have assumed that they are not worthy to be engaged on because they didn't finish schools. But what we've done is using languaging and using pedagogy that is rooted on centering people, restoring the people's dignity and communicating and engaging people in a manner that dignifies them. They too now understand. They too now are proud of being, I wish they could join us today. They are proud of being food sovereignty, advocates. So lastly, so what do we do?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I'm just looking at the time. We actually have 5 minutes on our official program, and I'm hoping that our co-keynote speakers as well as our discussants might have an extra 5 minutes to spare to respond to participants. I'm opening up for Q&A. If you have questions, please raise your hands. We'll do 2 rounds of questions. And I see that the chat has also been quite lively with a lot of comments coming through our chat there. I'm just wanting to see if there are questions that have been posted. And I'm relying on my colleagues that are helping out in the background around this. If there are questions that I may have missed, please do let me know.
Laurel has a hand up to raise a question.
Thanks, Claudia. Laurel, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to express my gratitude for this space and these really fantastic presentations and discussions. The timing is excellent. I think the shift in the movement that's been happening, it's been spoken about, is very vivid and alive at the moment. And so there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of thinking, and I'm really hearing the resonance with that. So a huge appreciation. My question is just really, and I have put this in the comments, and I will unfortunately need to leave at past, but it's really how we take this energy that's building, the movement that's growing on the ground, and at the NGO level as well in South Africa around food justice. And again, we've heard some examples of that, and there's others that are emerging and gaining traction. But in terms of how we can use this G20 moment to take this energy and translate it into some kind of influence, not just for ourselves, but as you said, the more that we're part of something bigger, the more likely we are to have influence. But any concrete ideas around that as we're in this moment in time in South Africa with hosting would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laurel, for that question. Before you answer, I just came across a question in the chat that I think links nicely to this one. Busiso is asking specifically to Olivier, what is the promise of Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty? So in tackling Laurel's question, can you please also link to that? Thanks. I'll hand over to you first, Olivier, and then move on to Raj. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this very stimulating exchange. Let me make perhaps two remarks in response to these interventions from Nangamso, Phelisa, and the questions that we just heard. First, I think whatever changes are recommended to combat food insecurity, to improve food justice, and to combat price volatility, there is a need for coordinated action in different fora, which means a political struggle. For example, whilst the South African presidency of the G20 is emphasizing the use of buffer stocks in order to combat price volatility, as we know, the same tool used in India to support the public distribution system of subsidized food items going to households living below the poverty line in India has been challenged by the United States before the WTO. And the WTO disciplines, therefore, should be amended in order to take into account the food security requirements of countries that depend on such tools. So that's one example of how different levels of governance and different fora should be aligned with one another when, for the moment, there is no such coherence in the way food systems are being reformed. And that is precisely where the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty can be useful. It's in ensuring that all major governments in the different fora in which they are influential and in which they vote move towards this transition to just and sustainable food systems. My second remark is that behind this political struggle that Raj described in such a stimulating way that is before us, there's a need to dispel the idea that markets send the right price signals to producers, commodity buyers, traders, and end consumers so as to guide the food systems towards just outcomes. In this area, prices do not work as a reliable indicator of what needs to be done, of which investments need to be made, of what people need to produce, and what they should be able to afford to buy, for three reasons. First of all, because markets respond to demand, not to needs. Markets respond to the purchasing power of people who can pay, the rich, not to the basic needs of people in poverty. And that's the first reason why markets cannot be trusted to send the right signals, particularly to food producers and agri-food processing companies. The second reason is because markets register power and do not challenge power. In other terms, prices reflect the respective bargaining positions of actors along the food chain, not what would be just, and certainly not what would allow to reduce rural poverty and to ensure just outcomes for food actors in the system. And the third reason why markets do not work is because when they react to price signals, they overreact because all producers receive the same information, or they react in a delayed way so that we have what specialists call the hog cycle problem. Low prices lead to underproduction and suddenly prices spike as a result of supplies being too low. And when the prices instead are high, all producers will produce more of the stuff for which they are well paid. As a result, overproduction results and the prices go down to the detriment of small food producers that have tried to align themselves with the trend. So this built-in volatility in food systems is one that buffers, stocks, food reserves seek to challenge, but it is a result not of the markets functioning not well enough. It's a result of the markets functioning too well by sending price signals that all actors in the system try to respond to, but in a way that is not managed well for the benefit of food security. I stop there, and I thank you for having me on this forum.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for your very compelling closing remarks. I'll hand over to Raj.
I can, it's very hard to follow Olivier because he said everything I wanted to say. But I will, I'll just observe though that, yeah, I mean, the last time the G20 met in Brazil, they created this global alliance against hunger and poverty. And if you look at the members now, many of them are people who would disagree violently with what Olivier just said. That you don't have people necessarily who are part of the global alliance who are convinced that markets are malfunctioning. You've got a lot of development banks there who would like to see markets function precisely in the ways that we've agreed are probably a bad idea. And so, I mean, I think it's just important to recognize that the last G20, at the last G20, the Global Alliance was advanced as a political project, particularly by the Brazilian government, as a way of saying, look, we really want to commit to this stuff. And I'm excited for that, but at the same time, we as the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, many of us were there pointing out that we've already got a way to commit to this stuff, and it is the civil society mechanism for at the Food and Agriculture Organization for the UN Committee on World Food Security, and the proliferation of venues for action can dilute the primacy of that place where civil society already has a seat at the table. So the UN Food Systems Summit, for example, which is a distraction from precisely the work that's happening at the FAO, is a worry for me. And so while I am excited that South Africa's presidency can in fact foster solidarity, which I think is a very key term, as well as equity and sustainability, that should happen by supporting the mechanisms that already exist rather than creating new ones, and recognizing that, in every government we will have our allies and our enemies, and that's what building counter hegemony against the power that exists at the moment is about, is by splitting off these comrades who are within the government and recognize these are the conversations that need to happen at the G20 meetings, that actually we need an insider-outsider strategy being developed that will survive the US presidency of the G20, which is happening next. So I think, yes, it's possible that as an outcome of the Global Alliance, we may have these conversations happening, but I'm not going to put my faith in that Global Alliance because we already have a mechanism for civil society to get together and hold governments to account, and I'm very reluctant to dilute its power. But maybe I should stop it there because we're over time, and thank you so much for having me.
Yes, we are over time, and really, I just want to thank you as our keynote speakers, and to also extend our big thanks to our discussants for making time for today's discussion. I also wanted to extend a word of thanks to all the participants who joined us this afternoon for this inaugural dialogue series, Why Food Justice Now?, which aimed to explore critical questions around food justice and its relevance to the G20 agenda. And finally, I want to say thanks to the amazing Heinrich Böll Foundation team that put this event together and facilitated the behind-the-scenes coordination during this event. Mase Ramaru, Lena Luig, and Ellen Lorimer, and Claudia. A big thank you. Before we end the call, I just wanted to invite you all to please attend our next dialogue on the 17th of September at 2 o'clock, where we will be launching a new paper by the Institute for Economic Justice, IEJ, on buffer stocks as a macroeconomic instrument for price stabilization. This will be a hybrid event, and if you're in Cape Town, please look out for further details. On behalf of Africa office, I want to say goodbye to you all, and until next time, keep well.